This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and welcome back to This Restorative Justice Life. We are coming in strong and starting off 2022 with a wonderful episode with Jodie Geddes. Jodie Geddes is an international speaker on restorative justice, as well as an author and advocate for racial healing and justice. In today's episode, you will hear a great conversation about creating space within circles to address the intersection between racial and restorative healing. But before we get started, I'd like to encourage you to check out our Instagram account, amplify.rj, where we are posting exclusive Reels content from this Restorative Justice Life podcast, as well as so much more in 2022 and beyond, where we will be posting restorative education content, advocacy work, and so much more. Without further ado, let's get into this episode.
Jodie, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
Well, thank you for having me first. I think the first thing I'll say is that I am a spiritual being who is really interconnected to the earth and the universe around me. My new role is also a mother. But I think more important than that, I think that I'm a parent, and there are ways that, you didn't ask me that, but there are ways that I parent in the world that is beyond this idea of what a mother is supposed to be and who a mother is supposed to be. So I think those are just 2 things that are really coming up for me right now when I think about who I am.
Who are you?
I would say that I am someone who is evolving, constantly evolving.
Who are you?
I'm a question, trying to figure myself out as the world is also probably trying to figure me out.
Who are you?
I'm a healer and a warrior, something Fania Davis often speaks about. I'm wondering during these times what it means to be a healer and a warrior.
Who are you?
I am a descendant of the Maroons and the Tainos of Jamaica, West Indies.
Who are you?
I am. I think I just am.
One more. Who are you?
I am the great-great-granddaughter of Mum, which is the nickname for my great-great-grandmother.
Oh my gosh, there's so much good in there. And I know we're going to get some of those intersections of all of who you are over the next little bit. But before we get into all of that, it is always good to check in. So to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
I'm doing well. I feel really great. I'm super excited to be here. I think this podcast is something that's really incredible and important. I look forward to listening to all the episodes and for you all to have that as well. So I'm doing great overall. You know, the morning started rough. I'm a mama to a 2-year-old, but I'm feeling really grounded and grateful for this opportunity to reflect and connect. So that's how I'm doing.
And, you know, for those who have been listening to this podcast for a long time, Jodie has been someone who multiple guests have said, like, oh, you need to get Jodie here. Like, I think as early as Jazz or Desiree, if folks are going all the way back there. But, you know, we finally made it happen. So I am just as excited to have you. There's so much to cover in, you know, your relatively short life. You've done a lot. You've made a lot of impact in this space. And so I think it's helpful to talk about the origins of your work and where you got started with this. But it was probably before you even knew the word restorative justice. So in your own words, how did that get started for you?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. it's strange to think about impact because I think I often don't see myself the way others see me. So for me, I was born in Jamaica, West Indies, and I migrated to the United States when I was 6. I am one of 5 children to grow up in America, Brooklyn, New York, Crown Heights, deep, deep, special place in my heart that taught me so many things. And I think about all the people I'm still in a relationship with that have really ushered me into this space. And I think it's important to just pay homage to Crown Heights because it's that home that really sparked a fire inside of me. I will say I was a very angry child. Mm-hmm. And so I had that warrior energy. I probably wasn't processing it in the right ways. And as a young person, I recognized that I was really angry at the world, and I internalized a lot of that anger, I think, into self-hatred around my own beauty, around my own worth. And so in my organizing, I found myself engulfed with so much emotion. And I really believed that what I was doing would change the world. And I got frustrated when impact didn't happen in the time that I wanted it to. I even remember being a debater in high school. I went to high school for law, very strange kind of schools in New York. And I was on the debate team, and I would get so angry during my debate competitions because I was so deeply passionate about the research I was doing and the case that I was building and how that related to the world. And for a lot of debaters, not everyone, but for a lot of debaters, it kind of started and ended there. So I took my debating craft very serious. And I once again thought about how I had internalized so much self-hatred and so much self-harm. And I was on this path towards wanting to be a lawyer, ultimately because I wanted to flip the system. And I'm really grateful that my path changed because I don't think I would have made it through law school. I think some people still have faith that I'm going to go. I don't think that's going to happen. I think because my professors would be like, actually, according to the law, you can't do that. That is not how you defend someone. That's not how you fight for justice. And so I went to a Quaker college, Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I was introduced to restorative justice actually through a professor who's now transitioned. But her class was so instrumental for me, not because it was the greatest class. She was an incredible professor, but there was so much conflict in the class. I mean, it had a lot to do with race and privilege, and people didn't want to confront that. People who were going on into the profession of law at that. And I just think about sitting in that moment and thinking to myself, I can't do this. I don't have the capacity to serve in the way that seems to be the right way. Become a lawyer, and that's how you defend people. That's how you push back. That's how you fight for justice. And this class made me realize that there was so much more healing that needed to be done than I even could fathom. You know, I knew that based on my own experience as a Black immigrant woman, but something shifted in that classroom from a place of conflict and a little bit of rage, or maybe a lot of rage. And so I think so many of my life experiences from this place of anger was more so misunderstanding the worth that I had internalized, or the lack thereof was outside of myself. You know, at 6 years old, I couldn't articulate the poverty that I was seeing. I couldn't articulate the addiction I was seeing, the police violence and terrorism I was seeing in my community. And then in this college classroom filled with people from different walks of life, here's this conflict erupting. Honestly, folks are kind of arguing around what was the best way to heal. And there were Black women, and of course, being quite honest, Black women, of course, who talked about not finding places in the system for healing and justice. Mm-hmm. And white women in the course who could not understand that, who said, people can go to therapy. Restorative justice doesn't do anything. And yeah, that was a turning point for me. So I think that a lot of my story is really about being led. Every single step I've taken, I've really listened to Creator to lead me. It has not been of my own. I always say that I wish I was a dancer. You know, poetry is a part of who I am. I wish I was a competitive poet, but that is clearly not the path for me. So I started it with this warrior spirit that was angry and was hurting. And I turned that into a space of healing that I think really allowed me to let go and to listen to my calling. I hope that's what you were looking for.
Yeah, we're going to dive into a lot more of it. I want to go off on what you just said. What was a moment for you where you realized that of this warrior energy isn't going to carry me all the way to where I need to go?
Ooh, child. Shout out to my folks, some incredible debaters, Adam, Davon, so many people from Towson University. This was years ago. I said I was a debater. Like, it was a real huge part of my life. And I went to debate camp. Oh, how strange. I went to debate camp, and these were some phenomenal Black debaters who were bringing in the infusion of arts into debate. So really pushing back against the academy, pushing back against the debate world. And my mind was blown. As a poet, I was like, wow, I can take poetry into my debate rounds. I can use Tupac. Anyone that knows me, it is an obsession. Tupac has been a huge part of my life in terms of guiding me as well. And so I just think about that moment in Towson one summer at debate camp. And I ended up I was going to go to Towson actually in order to debate. And I don't even know what it was. I think it was probably in a debate round where I remember when I first walked in, one of the judges said, if you're going to do performance, I'm going to vote you down. So basically already like letting me know, like, of course, we're the only like team of color in this room, already letting me know that if you're going to infuse basically like hip hop, poetry, authors that are not white men to justify your argument, I'm going to vote you down. It's, you will not win this round. And so I just remember walking out of one of my rounds so mad. And it was a little bit of an argument with the other team. And I was just, when I say I was mad. Like, I probably wanted to physically fight folks. And my coach at the time, I think I had not processed yet that this thing that I was doing wasn't going to transform systems and structures. And debate was a huge part, and still is, of the culture in New York. And she was like, Jodie, everyone else around you, everyone else around us, this thing that you're carrying, they don't feel that. Like this, the round opens, someone wins, and they leave and they go home. And yet I'm still pondering on, like, for example, 1 year it was about healthcare. I'm still pondering on the reality of the lack of care for communities all across the country, right? The debate round is done, 3-4 weekends. I'm still carrying this thing with me. And I had to, and I'm naming debate because it was this particular experience that helped me really build a critical lens to add some concrete understanding to feelings that I was carrying. So that warrior spirit that wasn't healthy was feelings. And being in debate, because you're doing your own research, you're developing your own case. I'm reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I'm reading Hooks, I'm reading Audre Lorde. I'm putting these pieces together to describe how I'm feeling. And I was like, I don't want to carry this for the rest of my life. I remember when an English teacher gave me the book, The Bluest Eye, and she said, read this, and her and the debate teacher, they were best friends, still friends till this day. And so I had this like awakening where I wasn't blaming myself for how I felt, but I also realized that I needed to kind of take this step back. I needed to breathe. Like, everything didn't have to be a fight. And some days it still feels like it is, realizing that everything didn't need to be a fight. And so I think for me, it was that particular moment of having this debate round, but particularly I think this debate coach and mentor really just saying it plain. I'm a feeling person. I was carrying a lot of feelings that I just didn't have language to describe, but I was just so angry. And a lot of it was more so because I internalized like systemic ideas around my own words. Like it wasn't so much that I was advocating to shift policy and to make change in my organizing and my debating because it created a bridge for me. But it was really, I was trying to convince the world that I'm here, see me and see my people, see my community, see the heights. And I didn't know that, I was a child that started probably from like 6 years old, the moment I landed on that escalator and, I entered into Crown Heights. And so I was really just developing language. So it's this kind of awakening of who someone is and having to define myself for myself and let go of the ideas of who I'm supposed to be.
Yeah. How did you find debate as this platform to channel all of that anger and processing of these ideas and emotions?
I had two really good friends they were amazing debaters. Honestly, if my coach is listening to this, I'm probably going to send it to her. She would call me a lazy debater. I guarantee it. Because I was, already a fast talker. I could speak a good game. Sometimes I probably didn't research as much as I should have. And I kind of went on sheer confidence. But she was our history teacher and she was coaching debate. And I met these two young women who were incredible debaters and I wanted to emulate them. And I mean, they're incredible academics and scholars, this day. And so I wanted to emulate that. And she also, she had an amazing course. And so from there, I just went to like debate practice. I thought it was cool. I was like, ooh, there wasn't a track team at my school because probably if there wasn't debate, I would end up running. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do debate. I love learning. I love knowledge, although I probably wasn't as great at the research and all of that. And so that's how I kind of ended up on the debate team. And at my high school, like the debate team was a big deal. It wasn't very cliquey, or if you were in a clique, you were friends with people across different groups. And so it was just a wide range of different people on a debate team, but it was an incredible experience. It taught me a lot of skills. This is an aside, but I hope that more and more schools, especially schools that serve Black and Brown young people, can be able to have more debate teams. I think it's really an opportunity to think about like critical thinking skills, being able to research, being able to build a case. And I think there's such a stereotype about what debate is. And I did policy debate. So they give you like a topic, an affirmative for the year, and you build a case, you build a negative and an affirmative case. But it definitely taught me a lot of critical thinking skills, a lot of researching skills that ultimately helped prepare me when I entered into college.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot. This is probably skipping ahead, but like in having to build the affirmative and the opposition case, like thinking about times now when you're in spaces with folks who have caused harm and like having to see things from another point of view, or folks who are descendants of folks who were enslavers, right? And, having to reckon with that past as somebody who is in the body of people who were enslaved, right? And liberated, but also, being able to very early on see both perspectives and understand where other people are coming from had to have been very formative and important for, the spaces that you're holding there. But we're going to get there. So from debates, from college, you talked about like the need for this healing in addition to this warrior energy that you're bringing, looking for justice. And like, I loved how you put it, like, it wasn't about policy. It was about like, see me, see my people, see us in the things that we need. Where did, that kind of trajectory lead you?
Yeah, thank you for that. Down so many paths. I think I've been super blessed and grateful to be in spaces with incredible mentors and people that believed in me, quite honestly. I think that when I came to that particular realization, like I think I mentioned a little bit, that I was able to really let go and to really be led and to be myself unapologetically. I often find it challenging to bite my tongue when I feel like there's a moment of harm or there's a moment of conflict, or even that there's just an opportunity for something to shift and for us to lean more into community and lean more into, honestly loving on each other, right? And I don't say that in this magical way, that's something that's hard for me to do on a daily basis. And I don't want to wait on some form of liberation, wait on some form of freedom to give me that. I'll share a story quickly. I have a lot of stories because mentors, I think, help to create some kind of spark in ways where they don't have to sit you down. The moment just happens and it's like slow motion. One of my mentors, Jada Monica Drew from the 252 in North Carolina. I remember we were having a conversation one time and I was just saying like, I just want to be free. And she said, aren't you free now? I'm like, oh, what you mean? Am I not free right now? And it caused pause because there's a lot of times there's this language around justice, freedom, healing, warrior, words that I use. And there isn't always space to imagine what that looks like, to imagine what that feels like, what that tastes like, what that sounds like. And so when she asked me that question, it was a moment for me to really think about the choices that I have in this life that many other people who've come before don't have, right? Even the choice for me to move from one side of the country to Oakland, California, even the choice to be able to serve with RJ, right? And I had not thought about those things, the choice to be on a path to breaking generational curses, I didn't think about that. The choice, to be the child my mom brought to this country that then was afforded an undergraduate education and a master's, right? I didn't think about those choices because I was thinking about this big monster that I saw, oppression and white supremacy, that I just had to fight, that my life's purpose was about fighting against that thing. And so I think a lot of just where I am right now is creating, I think, space to reimagine some of these words that I've often used and not created pause to really imagine and reimagine are words that I use a lot, because when I even enter into space and I'm in circle, I really try to create space for people to vision what we are talking about. That restorative justice isn't simply like about catharsis, like, ooh, feel, release, cry, shake, right? It is also about saying, how do I move this energy and what we've done in a circle? Because circle process doesn't automatically equate to restorative justice. I think often people are like, you're doing circle, you're doing restorative justice. It is so much more about that. How do we transform the systems and structures that allow communities and people to be in cycles of violence and harm, where there is the recognition that freedom exists now, and there is so much more to come. Mm. To be quite honest, I forgot your question because I just went down the rabbit hole as usual. That doesn't coming up.
Well, I'll come back to the question and we'll get the answer and continue that narrative. But I wanted to push in on what you just shared about, circles and restorative justice not necessarily being one and the same. Mm-hmm. I was reading through, I'll just subtly plug the little book of racial healing that you wrote with Thomas Norman DeWolf. And, one of the things that y'all were talking about was how inviting people, coming back into these racial healing spaces, people are very skeptical of quote unquote restorative justice processes. And because they think they're permissive, they don't actually get to accountability. They're not doing those things. There are lots of people who use words like transformative justice, who say that this is the same thing. How do you differentiate between what is quote unquote real restorative justice and transformative justice?
Oh, such a hard question. I get this often and it's so hard. Let's give you a whole dissertation. I think in short, I would say there is a lot of relationship between restorative justice and transformative justice. Of course, the historical origins of restorative justice and transformative justice look different when we think about transformative justice really responding to gender-based violence and harm. In restorative justice, there are many different origins that we can talk about. For me, I particularly identify restorative justice as a practice of remembering. So thinking about ancestral ways of being that have been taken from people, right? Many different communities, when we think about, indigenous communities, native communities, communities of African descent. And so that's a very, very short way of describing restorative justice. I wanted to just put that out there plain. For me, I would say that I'm often practicing restorative justice with a transformative justice lens, right? So when I am in circle with folks and I'm talking about a plan of support, I am utilizing transformative justice practices to really create space for folks to identify what and who their community is with a restorative justice process that brings their full self into the space, even for people who have committed harm. And I think even in me naming that, I think that sometimes folks only get one version of restorative justice, right? When I'm doing a talk or a presentation, I ask folks, how many of you know about restorative justice in relationship to the carceral system? And it's most of the people who are raising their hands, mm-hmm. right? Because their only view of restorative justice is this process this particularly circle process that only comes into play after harm has taken place. For me, the way that I practice restorative justice, or even my work at RJ, is how are we creating restorative cities and restorative communities, right? Where in moments that conflict happen, people have the ability to lean into that in healthy ways, and we don't make each other disposable, right? So to imagine a world where, we are in right relationship with each other, and when we get out of alignment, we have the tools and the practices to bring us back into the space. And it doesn't mean that you can't hold each other accountable. It doesn't mean that sometimes people can't be separated from community. What it means is, how do we then not make people disposable and discard their humanity? And so I think even expanding, particularly I'm speaking to you all, transformative justice practitioners, I think really expanding the view of restorative justice and allowing that to have an anti-racist, anti-bias lens, because the field in general of restorative justice, how people come to it, often is not talking about race. If you're a practitioner of color, you'll do that. It is a part of your identity. It is a part of how you walk through the world. So I said it in short, but not really that short. But I think for me, I think that there is a lot of synchronicity and relationship between transformative justice and restorative justice. I think there's opportunity for us to learn from each other. I think particularly for restorative justice practitioners, transformative justice can provide some tools and practices to really think about how restorative justice can lead to systems change, which I believe that restorative justice can transform, dismantle, and shift systems. But I also enter into this with a different lens, right, in terms of the larger field. And so I think there's a lot more relationship than we know it to be, and we can offer a lot of opportunity. I think a lot of it is misconceptions. That's why I think even this podcast is so important, because it creates space for multiple stories, right? Where folks are able to hear those different perspectives.
And I think most of the people who are asking that question from the TJ perspective are people who probably learned the words in the last year or two, right? And not having like the full context of like where this movement has grown from the folks at Generation 5 and like from the restorative roots, obviously through our ancestry, but like from the 1970s on. And you're right? So many people who were the originators of this work and who have been carrying this work were white and weren't carrying a critical racial lens as they were doing this work. And that's caused harm, but we're growing, we're evolving. I think, what's been beautiful for me is most of the people that I've learned from weren't white. And so like, of course, this was a part of my analysis growing up. And even the folks who were white practitioners, specifically shouting out Ora Shub, who is since passed, we're really conscious of that because of the spaces that they were practicing and the people that they were working alongside and with and for. That's where I got my start with the words restorative justice. Somewhere in your college career, I imagine, the words came to you because somehow, like, there are very few people I know who end up at CJP, the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University, right out of their undergrad experience. So when did those words come into your purview, and what made you gravitate towards this way of being, these practices?
Yeah, that course actually that I took, there was a whole unit focused on restorative justice. Not in depth. I didn't know the names of people because I think it's important to recognize that restorative justice isn't a long-standing field, right? So in some ways, it's a toddler. Let's say, it's a toddler. Preteen maybe for some. And so it isn't this large field. So literature is still being developed. Language is constantly shifting. There are other folks who use restorative practices. There are folks who do mindfulness work, but have an infusion of restorative justice. So there, I think it's important, even as we contextualize it sometimes in race, to think about things just change across different movements and moments. Things change. And it's important to name the evolution and at the same time create space for challenge. So with that being said, there was a unit specifically focused on restorative justice, and I wanted to know more about it. Interestingly enough, at the same time, our kind of disciplinary policy on the college was really beginning to find ways to infuse and adopt restorative justice. So really thinking about how do you hold a circle process on a college campus when honor code is violated, right? And it was something that was fascinating me. I had the opportunity to serve as, an advocate as a part of the process. I definitely learned a lot from that experience when we are thinking about working with, academic institutions, thinking about code of ethics, but also how to center students in that. So it was kind of me trying to live out restorative justice and then seeing it be practiced in a different structure and institution. And so from that class, I'm learning the language, but I'm also saying, how do I do more with this? It can't only be this. I had a lot of questions and I had a yearn to practice and be in space. And from doing that work with the kind of disciplinary system on my college campus, I did a lot of work with refugee and immigrant communities. I was a coordinator for about 2 different sites. And I was able to utilize restorative justice as a part of my diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings for master's in social work students who are going to be work with communities that has just been resettled. And so I was really utilizing restorative justice in those ways. I initially thought I was going to use it. This sounds so strange saying it now, but I was like, I want to develop policy for the United Nations, and it's going to be adopted across the medical field and the social work field. I don't know why I was thinking about this, but I saw this thing that had been introduced in one way because I was a community and justice studies major. So we were talking a lot about law. And I was like, this can be used in so many other ways. And I never thought I wanted to do a master's. And then I had a professor and I said, I really want to study restorative justice. Where do I go? And he said, Center for Justice and Peace Building. And I said, okay. And that's the other programs I applied to were master's in social work programs. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I could just infuse it in there. The only other program that was kind of conflict and justice studies, anything around conflict transformation, was at the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And that was just an act of faith. It wasn't because I wanted a master's, but I had this yearn for knowledge. And I felt like the thing that I had learned about in one way, there's so much more that could be done. And so that's kind of how the language came about. And I was led through really redefining it for myself. Meanwhile, of course, honoring its foundation.
Yeah. And let's make this an explicit plug for Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Justice and Peace Building. We've had lots of people who've come through there, who are working there on this podcast. It is in an academic setting, one of the best places to learn about this work. Of course, we know that you don't need the academia to learn these ways that are ancestral, but good people there. Sufficient plug.
Absolutely. That's a great plug.
Yeah. But you have the relationships that you gain there, the things that you study there, the things that you learn there, kind of set you on this trajectory that you've been on for the past, little bit of your life. What were some of the key relationships, key learning moments that you experienced while at CJP?
I'm going to name drop. I have to. I love everyone.
Let's do it.
I really appreciated CJP and just the community that they were able to build. One of the other things I also really appreciate is I think that they take feedback well. I'm a pusher all the time. That's a part of my identity. I'll never deny that. Like I said, I can't hold my tongue. So I feel like they're able to create space for cohorts to be able to give feedback and thinking about how they infuse that into their programs and their curriculum. One of the classes that I took that was really transformative for me was a class called Stoffer that was really looking at restorative justice and whole systems change. Yes, I remember the title, of course. Mm-hmm. And that class actually created the opportunity for me to dig a lot deeper into my core interests around, I understand in terms of transforming the relationships, how do we really transform systems? And it created an opportunity for me to really explore that. And I also had an opportunity to lean into arts-based projects to be able to describe it and to talk about identity. And so I was able to create a short film out of that, kind of asking people about who they are and who their people are and their vision around healing and their vision around restorative justice. And it was just such a powerful experience to think about the academic space and how I could bring in other parts of myself. Because I think for a lot of, what we can see as my academic career, I'm always feeling like it's half of my body in and half of it out. When I entered into CJP, a lot of what we were talking about, I didn't need the academy to teach me that. When I entered into undergrad, because I think I had these experiences that, and mentors that I think had to have a good talk with me about like moving to the South, particularly how my organizing lens was. And it kind of, helped open my eyes and help prepare me to enter into that space. But I think it gave me an opportunity to be a part of a world that I think many people are not a part of. I had the ability to write this little book of racial healing, never thought I would ever be able to write a book that could be so accessible to many different, groups of people. And so I'm thinking a lot about that restorative justice and whole systems course. And that's also, a class that often I go back to those materials to help me when I'm supporting different organizations who are looking to implement restorative justice, different, academic institutions. So it's a course that I continue to go back to constantly. So there was real learning and application coming out of that. And it was also just like a really great facilitation course that, there's a Center for Justice and Peace Building. There's often a hyper focus on restorative justice, but there are also many other practices we can utilize that is really important to be able to support creating restorative spaces. And so, that's another, facilitation course is another course that I took that I continue to go back to for really constant learning. I just had so many incredible experiences. I still talk with a lot of my peers, whether they were in my cohort or another cohort. We still have those longstanding relationships. We're often doing webinars and panels for each other. And so I think it was very interesting because you're in this academic institution, but there's so much relationship that is being built and so much opportunity to really connect deeply with each other. And I think to also challenge the idea of what it means to be a peace builder. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated the most, because I didn't see myself as a peace builder. And many times I still don't. I'm still wrestling with what that means. But there was this opportunity to really begin to think deeply about that. So I would recommend, even if you don't want to do a master's, there's a Summer Peace Building Institute where folks go take class for a week or even stay longer. So there's such an incredible richness. And I think that the program has grown so much. And so I appreciate all of those opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine was the short endorsement. You got the longer endorsement, and we'll link CJP in the show notes for sure, so folks can check that out. I mentioned it earlier, and you just mentioned it. Part of being in that community was you co-developing this book in the little book series, the little book of racial healing, around the framework of coming to the table, using a circle process to explore and heal. Folks can pick up the book, again, link in the show notes, for like $7 at your nearest online store, let's be real. But tell us a little bit about the origins of that project and what you hoped people would get. And, the book has been out for a couple years now, like how you've seen people interact with it and the impact that it's had.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm being even more transparent than ever. It was a scary experience. Besides giving birth, it was like the hardest thing I've ever done.
Oh, wow.
Probably harder than that, to be quite honest. It was interesting. They were doing some experimental work at EMU, creating spaces for different people, creatives, practitioners to get together to create something. And Tom and I had already known each other, and Tom was already the manager of Coming to the Table. And now I co-manage with Tom, which is still strange to say. And so he brought this idea to me. And we're both writers. We were gonna write for an anthology instead, submit something to CJP, maybe it'll get published, we'll do that together. But instead, through a series of different conversations with different mentors and folks in the community, we wrote this proposal on the Little Book of Racial Healing to really create space to introduce people to the Coming to the Table framework, as well as the history of this country, particularly around enslavement and its legacy. And they accepted it. I really prayed that it wouldn't be accepted. And Tom and I talked about that. I was like, I don't know how I feel. You know, like there's this idea that we talked a lot about in CJP, don't be married to your theories. And I was like, I'm writing this thing down that's permanent. My ideas are forever evolving and changing. And also in our world of online, you know, commentators, how will this be received? Right. And, you know, so it's very interesting in terms of that. And so I had a little bit of anxiety, maybe a lot. And there was also excitement around the possibility to dream with Tom. And so it was kind of emerging through a series of different conversations with mentors and folks, writing this proposal, and then here it gets accepted. Now the real work begins. You know, it's a little book that you're writing about racial healing. Yeah. And there's nothing little about racial healing. Yeah. But it was really a great experience, I think, for me to really get clear around, you know, our coming to the table pillars and how do we articulate that to an audience, from people who are just beginning their anti-racist journey to people who believe that racism doesn't exist, and to people who are really in the thick of it, right? Like chest deep, and are really saying, how do I move through this? Because we're never finished, right? We're never finished on this journey of unlearning and knowing. And so that's kind of how the book emerged.
Can you really quickly overview the framework of coming to the table?
Yeah, absolutely. So coming to the table is really thinking about how do we do that table, taking America beyond the legacy of enslavement. You know, that's what table stands for. And the way that coming to the table was founded was through the descendants of the Jeffersons and the Hairstons, kind of gathering together at Eastern Mennonite University in about 2005, 2006. So very family reunion style. And it was a really life-changing experience for many folks who attended. Tom DeWolf at that time, who is now co-manager with me, was also there. And folks wanted to continue to do that work and connect. And so over time, different local groups started to be formed. Now we have to build an organization. And Will Hairston, who was a descendant of the Hairstons, you know, he was working at Eastern Mennonite University at the time. And so it became the hub to really help center and focus coming to the table. Every year or every 2 years, we have our national gathering at Eastern Mennonite University. We do a series of ceremonies and a series of gatherings together. And so you have what started as this yearn to connect, particularly a lot of people who were doing their ancestral work, whether that was through ownership or through DNA, coming together over the course of a few days that was life-changing. And now saying, what does this look like to expand and elevate this work? And so right now we have over 45 local groups in over 16 states. And we have a series of working groups who are working on things like reparations. So we have a series of different working groups, including our reparations working group, who has been able to develop a reparations guide to really support people. And the reparations guide identifies the 4 pillars of coming to the table in relationship to a reparative action. So the book identifies the 4 pillars of coming to the table: uncovering history, making connections, moving towards healing, and taking action. It doesn't have to be done in that order, but it's often written in that order. Right. So really thinking about how do we uncover the history of this country, but also uncovering the history of our family's history and legacy. And I think that's sometimes the piece that's hardest for people to confront. You know, folks will say, well, my family didn't enslave anyone, right? And even if they didn't, there are ways that people were able to benefit and profit off of the labor of enslaved people. And so really being able to create space for people to move through that and holding restorative justice and trauma healing at the center of it. And I think that piece is really important. There are many spaces where people are talking about race. It constantly becomes popular, even if it's not the healthiest conversation. But one of the things that I think Circle Process affords us the opportunity to do is to really sit and listen without being so quick to respond, right? So someone could say something in the middle of their sentence, I'm already upset, I already disagree, but they haven't finished the thought, and yet I've already come to the conclusion, right? And so, you know, being able to sit and listen, I think creates space for me to really process and hear folks. And I think to also see their humanity. And in the book, you know, one of the things that I really, really loved about the book, and I'm so happy we made the decision to do, is to highlight different stories. So there are different stories that different Coming to the Table members actually submitted to us that's featured in the book, where they share their own experiences and they share their own family history. So people are not just, I think, learning with Tom and I, but they're learning with folks who have shared some really deep stories, you know, of pain and also some stories of joy.
Yeah, you've talked about how there have been multiple chapters that have popped up across the country in response to the larger Coming to the Table initiatives. What have the reactions or responses from folks from the book been like, especially since June, May of last year?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, thank you for that. I think most people, it's been positive responses. I think that sometimes, you know, if there's a news article that's written about us in the book, or, you know, some kind of interview, I think sometimes we get some of those comments from people. It's usually one or two, to be quite honest. I often get something via my Twitter and my Instagram, and I've just been in the organizing world for such a long time that, you know, at this point, I just ignore it. So I think Tom and I get separate responses. I'll name that. I think that's very true, that we get separate responses in terms of our personal social media. Overall, the responses have been really good. I think sometimes we might give a talk and people might be having some challenges, like really, really wrestling with their own identity. And it's particularly white men, if I'm being honest. And I think, you know, Tom does a really good job being able to hold that space. There are things that he can say that if I say, there's definitely going to be a different response. And that's something that we talk a lot about in our relationship. I think I've only had one experience where I wouldn't say it was bad, but someone identified only one piece in the book, and I'll name it. You know, we did a presentation for a group, and the person only identified the fact that Mike Brown Jr. was mentioned in the book. And I was very adamant that we kept that in the book. Tom was very supportive of a lot of decisions and the things that were kept in the book that I didn't want to let go of. But it just was interesting to me that that's the only thing that they identified in the book. So they read through the book and then came back to that and had some criticism that I think that we were able to really name the bias that existed, the explicit, not the implicit, but the explicit bias that existed. And I think that it was an opportunity for that person to really hear themselves. It was also recorded. So I think it was an opportunity for them to hear themselves. And one of the things that I named, I said, you know, that thing that is bothering you, it is an invitation to investigate that and how we see the disposability of Black folks in this country and ultimately probably all across the world, right? And one of the reasons for this, I want to highlight this, that Mark Lamont Hill, who can also sometimes be controversial, one of my favorite people, his book, Nobody, was so impactful for me. And he talked about the way that nobodiness is often assigned to Black folks who are killed through police harm, police violence, and in many other ways. And it was just a moment of pause for me. I use the language of disposability a lot, and I had not thought about this idea of nobodiness, right? That can be assigned to folks. And so I was really clear about wanting to keep that in the book. And there are a lot of things. It's hard, you know, to like think about what do you keep, let go, what do you add? And so I think about that experience because I think many other people are carrying that. They might not be willing to say it because it's popular to be anti-racist. So they might not want to be the disruptor in the room. And it tends to, you know, we tend to be talking to primarily white folks, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's who's buying this book, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That did stand out to me as I was looking through it this morning, right? That idea of nobodiness, and shout out to Mark, where it's not that like, it's not just that we're disposable, but it's that like you're disposable and like you're faceless, nameless, like who you are isn't important. Yeah. And I don't think it's exclusive just to like police violence.
Mm-hmm.
right? You've talked about like many of the other ways that anti-Blackness shows up. Some of the work that you're doing now with RJoy, right? With a whole city, right? And RJoy is Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. Really gets to some of those intersections of not just police and Black folks or school systems, schools or the criminal legal system. You really are talking about communities from the middle of pretty rural Virginia, all the way across the country to the West Coast, Best Coast, Oakland, California. You landed at Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, RJoy. You've done a lot of work there since you've landed. But tell us you can share some of that journey, but what are you up to now these days?
Yeah, I think it's just another thing that I'm super grateful for. I would have, if I didn't go to CJP, I would have never ended up on the West Coast, or maybe Spirit would have led me here. I never, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I didn't think about the other side of the country. Then when I was at CJP, Fania was there, was a gathering of different restorative justice practitioners. Many of the books we read, I was so oblivious to who was in the room
yeah.
because I just felt so honored that Carl invited me, by far the youngest person. And Fania was sitting next to me, but I was not very aware. I was like, oh, this is so cool. I'm here. Yay. This is amazing. Books. I love it. Maybe I wasn't doing as much work as I should have been doing for my courses, but I digress. And so, I remember we had to get in groups and we sat under a tree. And I think this is just so significant to who Dr. Fania Davis is. We sat under the tree. There was a different question proposed and she just turned to me and she said, let's let the youth speak. I was like, I'm not a youth. What do you mean? In my mind, of course. And, she said, what has it been like for you here? And I was like, what? And while I love CJP, I will name that, it was challenging. There was a lot happening in the world of organizing, so much happening. And it felt like sometimes in the academy, there wasn't a place to put it. As someone who had been organizing lobbying work, doing policy change, marches, protests, all of that. And it was just significant. And she invited me to RJoy. I don't think she thought I would take that serious. I think she was serious, but did she think I was going to take her up on an offer? And when it came time for practicum, it was South Africa or Oakland, California. People still trip up about that. And Spirit said, go to Oakland. And I came here. And I wanted to be challenged. I wanted to know, how do I implement restorative justice in my personal life? And how do I, do that out in the world? And what I appreciate, while it is not perfection and it's, not probably what we're striving for, that RJoy, we are really trying to build a restorative justice culture internally, the same way that we're holding that space out in communities, the same way we do that with organizations and schools who are trying to implement restorative justice. So, that kind of consulting is a part of our work where folks are really interested in implementing restorative justice. And then what we speak to them about is building that cultural change of restorative justice. That you might want to do a conflict and harm circle. Are young people happy? Do they feel safe? Are there adults and peers that they feel like they can trust? Really shifting that space so that education, can become that practice of freedom, that Lord talks about. And so I think, or hooks, I believe. So I think for me, that's one of the things that I really love about RJoy. And it's not even just education as a practice of freedom, just being as freedom, like I alluded to with Jada Monica Drew, just being able to live that out loud. One of the things, everything at RJoy makes me excited, to be quite honest. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of freedom to really build and create. So maybe not one of the things, two of the things that make me really excited is, we are doing some work with the county and have received funding to do this work. We're really creating this space between systems of mental health and care along with restorative justice. That is something that's not often done. And so we have about 10 weekly or more, actually, weekly restorative justice circles where people from the community and many people actually from other states, we have folks from Texas, New York, Virginia, who are coming to our affinity group spaces to really explore healing together, explore justice, explore harm, explore grief, talk about mental health and wellness. And we are also able to create a bridge between systems of care. Because for some people, the circle is enough. That's the community that they're looking for that they didn't have. And we know there are others in our community, especially during this time, that need those higher levels of care. And so a lot of my role is how do I equip the staff with mental health first aid training, for example, amongst many other things, right? Really equipping them with the language and the skills to be able to hold that circle because they do it so beautifully. And what happens in moments of crisis. And even if it's not crisis, how do we just support the wellness of folks? There's such a stigma around mental health. You know, folks will say, well, we have access when we have a new program. And yet this history and legacy still exists. And so what is our work to do as those who are in service to and with each other? And so that's one of the things that we're doing that makes me really excited. So, you know, we have a Black male circle, a Black women's circle, a youth circle that our young people run. They're going to be starting about 3 other circles. I'm hoping to start a provider circle in the new year for particularly providers of African descent. We're going to do some affinity spaces with that. So starting out a circle for providers of African descent to really be in community with each other, because who's in service to those that are serving, right? And I think sometimes even during the pandemic, because we're supporting people so much, there often isn't space to just take a deep breath where you don't have to like explain the work that you do and you can just be. And so that's one of the things that we're doing that makes me really excited, where I'm learning so much about mental health and wellness at the intersection of restorative justice. And, you know, I love the people who come to our circle and you really get to witness how much people are growing. I even think about my Black women's circle. It's not my circle, the circle that I attend, and I'm supposedly the circle keeper for. Like, they can function without me because there's been such a community that's been built that is whole, that is healing, and that is constantly transforming. And I get to be in space where we're witnessing joy. And in our tough moments, we can hold each other together. You know, I'll even share, I remember my daughter, I don't know what was happening. She was just crying. And I was like, oh Lord, I can't do this, you know? And they were like, it's okay, Jodie, let's see what's going on. I turn the camera on, we're sitting on the floor. She just won't stop crying. And she doesn't have the words to describe it. And, you know, and many of them are parents and folks are like, what about this? Did you try this? And one of the women, she's a nurse, you know, in women's health. And she said, if we need to get off, we can get on the phone right now. I got you, you know, and that's the community that's built in the circle, but it extends beyond that, right? Like, you know, people are on WhatsApp groups, people are going to retreats with each other. They don't have to check in with me to do that. But we've collectively created such a community that they're building relationships that expand beyond that circle. So that's one of the things that just makes me really excited about my work, that we can talk about mental health and wellness at the intersection of restorative justice. And restorative justice isn't one thing. It has the ability to be so much more than I think I'm even imagining it to be. Was that what you're looking for?
Yes, 100%. I'm thinking about like my follow-up question and how to word it. Because like there's this piece of me that's tactically saying like, all right, so the people who are listening to this is like, great, I want to start this in my own city with my own organization. Like, what I loved about what you shared is like, you know, this group can run without me. It's not to say that like you showed up and like, all right, y'all, we're going to have a circle. This is what's happening. Y'all are good, right? Like, that's not what it was. Can you explain the process that you went through with that circle specifically? Because like there are nuances to a youth circle, a Black men's circle, whatever affinity space circle that you're creating. What was the process for bringing that group together and bringing you all to the point where you are now? Confidentiality, of course, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah. And that's important. And when I say that, I think it's because we've done the work to build the container with each other. You know, one of the things I think right off the bat I recognize is a lot of the work starts before you ever get into circle. So thinking about doing the work on self, right? Am I ready to hold this space? And it changes from day to day. You could be having a bad day, but recognizing how that energy enters into the space and centering it. And sometimes it could be really centering yourself before you open the space, or it could be going to the space to say, this is how I'm feeling today. I've learned a lot about vulnerability and transparency because of this group, especially because I'm the youngest and I'm holding space with and for folks who are older than me, some who are identified as my elders. And that's always been a challenge for me because culturally things look different, but I'm in a particular kind of position. And so finding ways, I think, finding ways to continuously be transparent has been really important, and to be vulnerable. And I think to include the members in the practice. I think sometimes circle keeping can be seen as being a facilitator, even if folks are not using that language. So a lot of times people might jump right in and they ask a question, or, you know, especially because we're virtual, waiting for people to gather, I'm usually playing music, a conversation will already get started. And what I often do is I let go of the plan that I've created, and we just lean right into that conversation. I might say, that sounds great. And I guess because my practice, I'm already thinking of questions in my head, and I'll say, wow, that's amazing. I come into a conversation, I might say, let's go over our values and our agreements, and then let's get right into it. And so instead of just cutting off that conversation, I come back to that thing, right? So I think one of the things I've learned is to be able to let go of plans I've created. So making sure I'm planning for circle, but if the group is going somewhere else, allow that to flourish, because that's what they need in the moment. So it's not my work to control the group, but it is about ownership. So when I say the group can function without me, I don't think it's because they don't think I'm a valuable member of the group, but they feel safe enough with each other where it is not dependent upon me as an individual to create that brave space, to create that safe space. And that they also feel confident and equipped to jump right in. You know, there are moments where someone else, they're like, I'm searching for something, right? And they're like, let me go ahead and do the agreements. I don't feel, you know, any harm in someone who's a participant in a circle leading the agreements. That's a part of what we all do together to create community. It's like when at the dinner table and, you know, that one auntie might start saying grace, even if someone just assigned you to do it. We're all in this together. You know, we're all gathering together. And so, you know, I'm really intentional with listening to the energy that the circle is giving me, definitely doing values and agreements. Like that's always been important. I go over it every single circle we gather together. It's very rare that I don't go over it. One of the agreements that we have, and I'm naming this because it's interesting, when you start building a culture, you start to notice things become more fluid. One of the agreements is ask permission before giving feedback. We never honor that because, and once again, agreements are courtesies. They're not about perfection, but because we've built that culture of safety, that we're able to do that. But what happens is if there's a new person that comes and joins circle, we begin to honor that agreement because we recognize now this energy is shifting. The space is evolving, right? And we want to bring someone else into the group and also create that brave enough, safe enough space for them. And then, you know, the last thing I'll add is I'm really intentional with the materials that I share, and think about the impact it will have on people's bodies. So even images that I might share in a video, if we're talking about like Black women's, you know, maternal health, really being careful with the images that I'm sharing, right? To be able to get a message across or a point across, doing a lot of meditation and yoga, looking to other Black practitioners when I'm thinking about activities and resources. And so it's constantly cultivating that relationship. So there are a number of different things that I do, but I think it is really about listening to the energy of the circle and let it carry us.
Yeah. Has the circle run or met without you?
Yeah, it has.
Yeah.
Usually I just like open up the room. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, we also have a WhatsApp group. So people are communicating through this WhatsApp group like all the time. I miss most of the messages. Yeah.
And this is like a curiosity that I have as someone who is both facilitating and teaching this work. That, you know, because I have this curiosity, I'm sure it'll help somebody else. And I realize now that I don't really need to qualify or justify why I'm asking the question, but here we go. You know, one of the things that I'm often fearful of because of the way that I came up in this work, where we're bringing this work into schools. And, you know, in chapter 6 of the little book, like you give folks an outline for like how to keep a circle, right? And there's something about like giving people like the ABC 1, 2, 3, step 1 through whatever that like is super dangerous. because folks are able to take that and do what they will. I think what's beautiful about like what you've done is like you've had, like, I don't even know if you've introduced the like the technicalities, the science, quote unquote, of like circle practice to these folks, but like because y'all have practiced being in space together, that is a natural way for folks to continue to be in this. And I realize in some ways I'm answering my own question, but like it has to be like that head knowledge, the tactical, the logistical, married with like experience, felt experience, and lived practice before we're like, oh, I read the book, I'm good, let's go.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that it can be very dangerous. That was a part that was really challenging to be able to write. And I think one of the reasons is we can use the language of circle process a lot. And if people have never engaged with it, they don't know what it means. And so in the editing notes, it was like, this needs to be explained. And for me, even my language that I use to explain restorative justice and circle process is not often what is written in a textbook. You know, I said it was a practice of remembering. People are like, what do you mean? And then I'm like, okay, let me go into this other definition, right? And then I'll scaffold it with my interpretation. So I think it was really challenging, but I think for the book, it needed to be done. I do think that in the field and in the practice and in teaching, there sometimes can be the practice orientation that's missing. So like an example with RJ, even virtually, we are holding trainings in restorative justice circle process. And so even the people who are in the training, they're going over values, they're going over guidelines and agreements. It is very much that practice orientation. So people also have the feeling of being in circle and understand it. You know, and usually on day 2, they get to develop their own circles. So having to even think critically about a check-in that might seem like something that's real easy, but also how do you read the group and not ask a question that in fact might not work for a check-in question and can shift the energy somewhere else. So I think it's this fine balance between kind of the practice and between the knowledge. And it's also interesting too, because a lot of times when I do training, whether it's RJ as a part of my consulting, I might train someone like 3 or 4 times and they still haven't practiced. And I'm just like, do it with your family, do it with your friends, even organizations. They're like, we need your support in implementing, but you may have done maybe 2-3 trainings with them and they still haven't just sat down in a circle and asked one question. You know, like there's this, I think that there can sometimes be a fear of being seen because people are unsure that they will be held, you know, and I think, of course, it's our role to really create space for those courtesies because it really does shift the container. You know, times where I've seen people not go over values and guidelines, you know, even if I'm doing a presentation, I'm giving some guidelines. Sometimes I'm like, we all good with this? Usually people I haven't had an experience where someone's like, thumbs down, I can't live with this. But I really try to do that to do, you know, and I often call it container setting. Because even if I'm asked to give a talk, I want folks to know that they are a part of the collective space, you know, and I'm trying to shift the energy. I want to be in relationship with you, even if I only have 30 minutes to basically speak at you. How can I still shift the container to be in relationship with you?
Yeah. Oh man, there's a whole nother tangent we can go off, like what you said about like people in organizations specifically, and keeping in mind schools are organizations, communities are organizations, right? Being afraid to be seen because something about that organization has told them that it's not okay to be seen for who you are before. Like people don't get over that just like that. Man, so much. But you know, we're already at an hour plus, and I want to make sure that we get to the questions that everybody answers. Really quickly, in your own words, define restorative justice.
Yikes. Okay. Restorative justice for me is a practice of remembering wisdom, healing, warrior spirit energy that has been taken that restores the dignity and humanity of everyone.
You've been doing this work for a minute in many different settings. What has been like an oh shit moment, or like a mistake or something like, oh, I wish I did something different? And what did you learn from it?
An oh shit moment I can think about is when I was doing some circle work, particularly around race. And I remember I got triggered. Someone said something, I got triggered. I felt like they did it intentionally, to be honest. And at that time, with my co-circle keeper, because they knew me so well, I just tapped them on the shoulder and I checked out. I just checked out. Like I was staring, but mentally, I was at like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or something. I just was no longer in the space. And so that's an oh shit moment for me. And I think that it could have been an opportunity for a deeper conversation to happen amongst the group in that moment. A conversation later happened where there was need to process some things. And I didn't name the personal impact on me, but I think that could have been a learning moment for folks in the group to really think about how facilitators and holders of space are also participants, because I think sometimes that's forgotten. And so I think about that oh shit moment because I felt it. I really felt it in my chest. Mm-hmm. And I just tapped my co-circle keeper and they already knew because we had that relationship. And I was staring into space, but I was pretty tapped out.
Yeah. No, that's so tough. I'm reflecting on being in that facilitator role and just like putting up walls for myself for protection. And what that inhibits, what connection that inhibits in the room. One, like having a co-facilitator would help that, but like two, like if my walls are up, people can still see that, right? Mm-hmm. And like what vulnerability are they going to extend? Because like, you know, part of my quote unquote walls being up is like some performative, rehearsed, like vulnerable sharing, right? But you know, for the people who are in tune and intuitive, like maybe being able to see beyond that. And so like I think for me, as I'm growing in this work, part of this is like being able to do a lot of that healing of self so I can then go out and be vulnerable in ways that like are actually putting myself out there. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what's the question you ask the
Whitney
circle?
Houston.
Okay.
Tupac Shakur, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, and Dr. Ivor Carruthers.
And what is the question you ask that circle?
What world do you want to create?
Jodie, what is the world that you want to create?
I want to create a world where young people can play in the sprinklers, particularly the fire hydrant, without worrying about that there won't be enough water or they're too loud and proud. I know that was like a metaphor, but that's the world I want to create.
All right. The follow-up to that is, what are you doing to make that world?
I'm gonna cry. Oh my God, what's going on? I think that I am challenging myself to be the greatest parent human that I can be. That I hold space for this young child to know that they are enough in a world that I anticipate may tell them different, and that they no longer are of me, but are of the world, and can just allow the spirit of who they're meant to be flourish, like let it live without having any attachment to me. Because I have a lot of faith and hope that little Cielo is gonna be anything beyond who I can imagine her to be.
What is an affirmation or mantra that you say to yourself as you're building that world that you want people here to know?
To be honest, I might need to start saying those affirmations to myself. I don't think that I often am able to prioritize that. Like I see the world, and sometimes in my body, I don't believe in that world, if I'm being fully transparent. I know that it exists. Sometimes it's hard to believe it. So maybe I believe.
Yeah. I like that. And I think that's hard to, Miriam Cobb says, hope is a discipline, right? Like we need to like build in those practices to help us believe that like there's something beyond this really difficult situation that we're in right now. 2 more questions. Who's one person I should have on this podcast? And before you answer, you have to help me get them on.
I will say Fabrice, one of my really good friends, also a former CJP graduate. He has a platform called Syllable, which is a writing platform. I'm just basically talking about Fabrice right now. He is incredible. I think he is also the epitome of hope. And he also is probably the reason that I am co-manager of Coming to the Table. He invited me to a Coming to the Table. And since then, I've never looked back. Maybe one time I did, but then I came back to the table. So I think my really good friend Fabrice, and I think he'll say yes immediately. He doesn't say no much.
Love it. Looking forward to that introductory email then, or DM, because that's where this happened as well. And then finally, how can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Yes. Okay. You can check out Restorative Justice for Open Youth. Check out the incredible work we're doing around truth-telling, racial healing, restorative justice, trauma healing, a number of different things. We are here. We're showing up in community because we love community. You can also check out my personal work at jodiegeddes.com. I also have a podcast called Maternity Leave that explores mothering and everything in between. Just 2 friends being moms together, along with my really good friend, Jamie Rogers. And so if you check out jodiegeddes.com, you'll find all that information and stay up to date. And I hope to be publishing something soon. It will likely be a collection of poems, so something a little bit different, but I think gives you some deeper insight into who I am, the woman that probably talks in most of the metaphors and similes.
Love it. Love it. Little Jodie, the professional poet. The dream still lives. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your stories. We'll be back with another episode next week.
Thank you, Jodie. There is so much that we can learn from Jodie today. I wanted to highlight one of the things she said in the podcast. She said, "I want to create a world where young people can play in the sprinklers without worrying that there won't be enough water or that they're too loud and too proud." And I think that this really sums up how can we cultivate freedom? How can we cultivate freedom within our classrooms? How can we cultivate freedom within our conversations? How can we cultivate freedom within our relationships? The United States of America is always considered a, quote, free country, but are we really free unless we're all free? And I think in order to be all free, we have to use the tactics of racial healing and reckoning that Jodie Geddes suggested in this episode. Even beyond America, in order to cultivate freedom for future generations, we have to reckon with and acknowledge our past and our history. We have to create equity in order to, in the future, be able to restore it to that place. Equity looks like everyone getting the chance to spend their time relaxing in the sprinklers. How do you cultivate freedom and equity in your life? As always, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.